Okay, thank you everyone for joining this session, Partnering with International Research Organizations and the Grants Process. My name is Cosima Garst. I'm a Systems Policy Analyst in the NIH Office of Policy for Extramural Research Administration, and I will be your moderator for this 45-minute session. I will be presenting our panel today. First, we'll have Emily Lindy, who is the Director of the Grants Management Program at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and Dr. Glenn McGugan, the Program Officer in the Parasitology and International Programs Branch in the Division of Microbiology and Infectious Diseases, also at NIAID. The format today includes a short presentation followed by Q&A with our presenters. Throughout the presentation, we will have Q&A staff to answer your questions in the Q&A box. So let's get started. Your first presenter will be Emily Lindy. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Cosima. Glenn and I have a lot to share with you, so we're going to jump in and start straight away. So Glenn, why do we support international research?
That's a great question, Emily. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the session. So first, international applications present special opportunities to tap into unique talents, resources, populations, or environmental conditions that may not be present here in the US, or maybe they augment existing resources here. And the other thing is that the project may have specific relevance to the mission and the objectives of the awarding IC. Next slide. For example, NIAID, where we work, has a special interest in international collaborations. This is a really long-standing interest. And so several years ago, NIAID convened a task force on infectious diseases, and they provided a recommendation that NIAID should continue its efforts to foster, support, and expand international studies of infectious diseases. So the NIH invests in both direct foreign awards and US-based awards with foreign components. And you can see some of the breakdown here for the past few years. So Emily, who is eligible to apply for NIH funding?
Good question, Glenn. So the first thing that you need to know about eligibility is to find the funding opportunity announcement, or the FOA. You'll hear us say that a lot of times throughout this conference. It's always going to be the place that tells you whether or not, as a foreign applicant, you can apply, or as a domestic applicant with a foreign component, that you would be allowed to apply. And I'll show you on the next slide what that looks like in the FOA. So the second thing that you're going to need to know is, if you are a direct foreign applicant, you must always submit a budget, in detailed budget. And then the last thing to know is that there are times when the FOA is specifically promoting collaborations between US organizations and foreign sites. And in those instances, you're not just going to read the eligibility section for the institutions, but you're going to read the entire body of the FOA to look for what kind of science and what kind of collaborations we're looking for. So this is where you would find the information on eligibility. Here you would see that non-domestic entities are eligible to apply, or foreign components, as they're defined in the NIH grants policy statement, are eligible to apply. So always look in your FOA. A few more things to know about applications. There are two types of FOAs, really. One is for solicited applications and one for unsolicited. For the unsolicited applications, these are really ideas that are coming from the investigator. They have standing receipt dates, generally 3 times a year, and they're usually reviewed centrally at the Center for Scientific Review. For the solicited applications, usually that's an IC or multiple ICs looking to solve a specific high priority grant question, scientific question. And that will have much more detailed information about the science they're looking to support and the review criteria associated with those applications. There's generally only a single receipt date for that, and they're often reviewed within the IC that's issuing the funding opportunity announcement. This is a small snippet of all of some of the mechanisms that NIH supports throughout the years, our activity codes. The point here really is to let you know that we have funding mechanisms to support graduate students, postdocs, and really any researcher throughout the life of their career. And there's also sometimes very targeted FOAs for international research or international research collaboration. And then lastly, one thing to remember is that there are certain types of mechanisms for which foreign grantees or sometimes foreign components are generally not eligible to apply. So those would be things like our institutional research training grants or construction grants, because we don't perform construction projects outside of the US, or the small business area with the SBIRs and the STTRs. And these are all listed in your NIH grants policy statement, and again, listed in the FOA. And then you've probably seen this a lot, and we'll bring this up from time to time, but it's a really good thing to know. How do I find my funding opportunities? So you can find them in the NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts. And if you're not set up for the listserv yet, I highly encourage that you do that. And this will list every opportunity that there is at NIH. You are able to search this by any keyword. So let's say you're interested in type 1 diabetes or tick-borne diseases, you can type that in here and you will find all of the related announcements to that. You would also need to know who you should contact in the FOA. It lists 3 contacts always. One is the scientific and research contact. That would be the scientist who would be appropriate for answering any scientific type questions. There's the peer review contact, and then also the financial or grants management contact. That last contact would be able to answer financial questions for you, questions on the budget or allowability of certain costs that you would like to propose within the budget. So Glenn, do international applicants have different requirements?
Yeah, that's another great question, and one that we get quite often. And the first thing to consider is, what is a foreign component? And so from the NIH's perspective, a foreign component is a performance of any significant scientific element or segment of a project outside of the US. So these may include involvement of human subjects, animal subjects, collecting data, using facilities, and so forth. Importantly, having a foreign consultant, even if foreign travel is involved, is not necessarily considered a foreign component by NIH definition, unless it also satisfies one of those other activities mentioned above that you can see on the slide. So what is the likelihood of getting funded from the NIH? It's another question that we get often. And to give the best chance of success, it's important to choose an appropriate scientific topic. And what I mean by that is one that fits your expertise, but that also aligns with the mission of the IC. The topic should be important, and that means it can have a high impact potential. And it should be unique. So that is something that the NIH is not already funding. And so you can always reach out to program staff if you have any questions about that, the appropriateness of your idea for the NIH. And as Emily mentioned, you can identify a funding opportunity through a variety of mechanisms. But another tool that I find particularly useful is the NIH Reporter. And so with this tool, you can search based on key terms. So let's say that you study a protein in a particular parasite, for example. You could search by the name of the organism, by the name of the biochemical pathway, and this will allow you to see the types of applications that are already funded in that area. And I bring this up because it's particularly useful for international investigators. Let's say that you are looking for a potential collaborator, that's someone here in the US. So this is a great place to start. And then you can always reach out to NIH program staff for more specific scientific questions. But in review, there are a few things to consider that your reviewers will be asked to address. And those include your publication record, if you've had previous funding, such as from the NIH, and that you need to justify the foreign site. So another thing to remember is that eligibility does not necessarily equal competitiveness. So the other is to read carefully the review criteria. So once you find a funding announcement, This will detail the types of items that reviewers will be looking for. And that's important because you'll need to address each of those in your application to ensure the best chance of success. And so if you have questions about those, as Emily mentioned, you can always reach out to the contact people that are in the FOA. And then finally, I would say be persistent. Next slide. So the NIH receives many more applications than we have money to fund. And so that means that even really good science may not always be funded on the first try. So roughly half of the applications that we receive are triaged. And what that means is they're not discussed orally, even though they do receive a full written critique. So don't be too discouraged if you don't get a great score the first time. Read through your critiques carefully, and then you can always contact program staff like myself to provide advice on steps moving forward. So Emily, what is needed to be able to submit an application to the NIH?
Great question, Glenn. So generally speaking, and this is a little bit in flux, so we're going to talk about how things are changing right now. But generally speaking, there have been 5 applications, registrations required to submit an application, and a 6th registration that's required if you are lucky enough to have submitted a good application that scored really well and was selected for funding. That 6th one is the registration for the Health and Human Services Payment Management System, which is what allows you access to your funds that you've been awarded and how you draw it. And why am I starting with the last one first? That's because that one is actually, that registration is based on your bank account name, the name of your entity on the bank account. And if that registration doesn't match all of your previous registrations, it impairs your ability to draw funds, and it actually takes quite some time to clean that up. So what I like to recommend to people who haven't applied before, think about what your end goal is and what you're going to have to use at the end to really think about how you want to register your organization. So let's walk through the registrations required for submission of application. So one is grants.gov, and the other is the NIH ERA Commons, and those are both institutional profiles. There's also the System for Award Management, which is a registration that has to be renewed annually. And at this time, the System for Award Management houses a DUNS number, but it's transitioning from the DUNS number to the Universal Entity Identifier, which we're going to get to in the next slide because we're actually in flux for that. And then the last one is the NATO Commercial and Government Entity Number, or the NCAGE number, right? So once we've transitioned from the DUNS number to the UE, you will actually have one fewer registrations to become an applicant, which that's great. We always love it when things become simpler. So there we go. So let's talk about the DUNS and the Unique Entity Identifier, or UE. So the goal is for the entire federal government to transition by April of 2022. That's just around the corner from now. The implementation actually began in SAM in the middle of 2021. And in October of 2021, you'll have seen in the ERA Commons, your institutional profiles will have been edited to allow to bring that UEI in. There is no extra action that's required by the organizations at this time. We're bringing that information in from your SAM registration. And then for new applicants, that UEI will be required for applications that are going to be due on or after July 25th, 2022. So again, just around the corner. And if you have any questions about this, there's a few guide notices that are out there. There's this one, and there's also 21170. If you're a foreign organization, you might be a little bit stumped when it comes to filling out the application and it's asking for an entity identifier number. This is a number that's actually issued by the US Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS. And since most of our foreign applicants would not have an IRS issued number, you can use a string of 4s. However, if you've already been a successful applicant and we have issued a temporary or an internal EIN number for you, you can also use that number, because that is the number that we will continue to use consistently once you've received funding. So is it required that you contact NIH before you submit an application? So generally it's not required, but certainly, as Glenn has said, we encourage you to contact the program official and talk about the science prior to submitting an application. But there is one time where you do absolutely have to request NIH's permission to submit an application. And that's when you're requesting more than $500,000 in direct costs for any of the budget periods for which you're submitting an application. So let's say you only have $450,000 direct costs in the first year, but your budget escalates to over $500,000 in the third year. Then at that, because that exceeds more than $500,000, you would have to seek permission from NIH to submit that application prior to submitting that. And we will be looking for that acceptance letter or that approval letter that you could submit that when you submit. We also encourage you to submit a letter of intent. Generally, we encourage that when you're submitting to an FOA that's specific, or an RFA where there's limited numbers of opportunity for you to submit an application, so those single submission dates. We use that really to plan the review and how many applications will need to be reviewed. And then one other question that we receive all the time is, when should you use a cover letter? Well, we certainly recommend that you use it with any application, but especially when you are looking to request a specific IC assignment. So for example, if you're studying diseases of the lungs, but you're not as much interested in the disease, but you think that the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute would be a better fit than an NIAID, that's one instance where you could request an institute or center assignment. And then the other one is if there's a specific review group assignment that you feel would best understand the science that you're proposing in that application. So what am I allowed to include in my budget?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's one that I get often, particularly how big should my budget be, or how small should it be? The most important consideration from the program side scientifically is that whatever budget you propose should be appropriate for the science that you propose. So if not, if your budget is inflated or too small, then it's going to cause questions during review about feasibility. And so for international applicants and collaborations, it's also important to keep in mind that salary cost may be quite different in the foreign site as opposed to the US, and also the availability of supplies, which could be quite different as opposed to here in the US. And so Emily, what about budget considerations?
Well, there's definitely a couple of places to look for budget considerations. The first thing you're going to want to think about is allowability of costs. Is this the type of cost that can be charged against an NIH award? So NIH lists in the NIH grants policy statement in chapter 7.9.1, not all of the costs, but most of the costs that we see frequently on grant awards. So that's a good place to start, and that applies to all applicants and grantees. And then in addition to that, in section 16, so this chapter in the grants policy statement is dedicated to foreign applicants and domestic applicants with foreign collaborations. We provide a little bit more guidance on some costs that are specifically allowable or not allowable under the foreign awards or foreign collaborations, and some of those are noted here. The other thing to remember, as you would if you are any grantee, is that we have to follow the four costs for the cost principles. So you're going to ask yourself 4 questions. Are the costs reasonable? Would a reasonable person having to pay for this item pay this much amount of money for this? If they don't, we will actually question that when we go to review and prepare the award. Are the costs allocable to the award? So in other words, are the costs you're trying to charge specific to this project, and you can identify them for the needs of this project and this project only? are they consistently applied to all sources of funds? So for example, if you got funding from USAID and the Gates Foundation and NIH, are you applying all of the rules the same, regardless of your source of funding? And then the last thing is, do they conform with the allowability? So this goes back to the previous slides. Are they listed as allowable costs under section 7.9.1 or in chapter 16? Or if you want to look, you don't find the cost there, and maybe you think that there's another place to look, the governing document that's above the NIH grants policy statement for allowability of costs is actually the Uniform Administrative Requirements, which are listed under the Code of Federal Regulations, 2 CFR 200. And then this is a very frequent question with our foreign applicants and foreign collaborators, and that is, I don't know how to calculate my F&A costs, or why is it 8%, and what can I use my F&A costs for? So the costs have been 8% for a long time. It's specifically 8% for foreign grantees and foreign collaborators because it does not cover all of the costs that F&A, or facilities and administrative costs, cover for U.S. organizations. For U.S. organizations, we're allowed to pay for facilities costs. But for foreign organizations, we are not allowed to pay for facilities costs. So the 8% is actually to support the costs of compliance with federal requirements. And you know we have a lot of requirements. They're all listed in the NIH grants policy statement, but just to name a few, they're the costs for the protection of human subjects, for animal welfare, invention reporting, and on and on. So those are those types of costs, of compliance costs. And they're calculated, we changed a few years ago, and they're calculated much the same as your domestic counterparts are now. And that is that you are allowed to apply 8% to the total direct costs, less tuition, equipment, and subawards in excess of $25,000. So I'm not going to walk through how you calculate all of this, but I did include some slides for calculating this. And because math is such a creative enterprise, you can actually use many different forms of math or sequences to get to the same answer, right? So I've included here a couple of examples if you were starting with the highest figure and subtracting out the costs that are not allowable for F&A, or the additive method where you're calculating it the other way. So
go ahead, Emily. Go ahead.
What are the requirements for collaboration with subawards? So ultimately, it's the U.S. Well, if you're collaborating and the primary grantee is a U.S. organization, it's ultimately the responsibility of that U.S. organization to comply with the terms and conditions of award and all of the regulations and policies. That would be true if it were a foreign award with a foreign sub as well. So the primary institution is always the institution that has the ultimate responsibility for compliance with the terms and conditions of award, including everything in the grants policy statement. So remember that in these forms of collaboration, there will always be scientific involvement at an international site. So it's important to make sure that each institution understands the rules and regulations, and that you determine who has the authority to sign for that foreign organization. Sometimes the hierarchies at foreign organizations differ a little bit, and so you definitely need to figure out who has the authority to commit the institution to that work. You're always going to need a written agreement, and that written agreement should always address a few things. But just to name a few, you're going to address what is to be done, how the progress is to be reported to you, how and when the funds will be transferred from the primary grantee to the sub-grantee, right? That should all be in your written document so that everybody has an understanding of what the expectations are and what the requirements are.
Yeah, so a few overarching considerations for foreign institutions is to remember that they function differently than the US-based institution. For example, there may be language differences, time zone differences, there may be issues with internet access. You need to identify the sponsored program staff and also make sure that they're following the NIH funding requirements. I guess the biggest piece of advice I can offer you is to plan for delays and apply early. That way, if you run into any issues, you'll have time to fix them before the deadline. This is something that's come up with numerous applicants. So what about the reporting requirements if you do receive an award?
So the reporting requirements for foreign grantees are really much the same as those for domestic grantees. Everybody submits the same progress report, and there's 3 questions in the progress report that address foreign involvement in some way. The first is section E4, which is asking for the amount of funding that is spent in a foreign country, and this is an aggregate by country. The second is in section G9. I like to highlight this one because here we're really looking for what the scientific activity was that was performed outside the US. And you're going to be answering this question regardless if you're spending funding outside of the US, right? If there is significant involvement, you will be reporting it under G9. This is one I think that people overlook from time to time. NIAID has actually begun adding a term of award to help grantees out to let them know that there is an expectation that we would be requiring reporting here. And then the third is that in D1 participants, they're going to ask if an individual's primary affiliation is with a foreign organization, and then if so, what country. Lastly, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll do this quickly. Please remember that if you're subject to audit requirements as a foreign recipient of NIH funds, that requirement kicks in if you receive more than $750,000 a year in HHS funds. So if you receive funding from CDC and NIH and USAID, the USAID award, since it's not part of HHS, would not count towards that threshold, but the NIH and CDC awards would. And then lastly, closeout, which is also applicable to all grantees. There are generally 3 reports that are required. That's the final financial report, letting us know how much money you've expended and what unobligated balance remains, if any. Also, the final invention statement and the final progress report, generally in the form of the final RPPR. But if you've received continuation funding, it's sometimes in the form of an interim RPPR. What if I want to make changes? I got my award and I want to make changes.
Yeah, that's a great question and one that we get often. And so you'll be able to make some changes on your own, but some changes require prior approval. And I won't do everything on this slide, but the first point is changing the scope of the project. So we often get questions, well, what does that mean? Basically, if you change an animal model, if you change a human subjects model, if you change the specific aims that you were approved for in the review, maybe shifting from one disease to another or changing the PI, all of these require prior approval from the NIH before you make that change. So in terms of the budget, Emily will speak to that.
So I'm going to make 2 points. One is prior approval should always be prior, right? So you need to ask us before you make the change. And next, when in doubt, ask. So budgetary changes don't always require prior approval. If you have a change in your budget of greater than 25%, it is an indicator of change in scope. So it doesn't require in itself approval, but if it changes the scope, whether it's more or less than that threshold, you would require prior approval. And I highly encourage you to visit Chapter 8 in the NIH Grants Policy Statement, which covers this. If you're requesting a transfer of an award to a foreign organization, either from a foreign organization or from a domestic organization, I would advise you to plan early. Transfers from one organization to another often take time, and the transfer of a grant to a new foreign organization always requires prior approval and an additional level of review by the NIH advisory board or council.
And so to leave it, are there any other considerations that we should leave the international collaborators with?
So I'm not going to cover this slide entirely, but I'm going to encourage those who are foreign institutions who have to fill out the institutional financial conflict of interest policy to seek out those sessions here, because this has been, I think, the single biggest hurdle that we're seeing with our foreign awardees in the past year. So definitely attend those sessions. And then the last thing is to always review your notice of award, look for special terms that are specific to your award or things that allow you to, or things that are tied to your reporting requirements, whether it be more frequent or less frequent or more or less things. So specifically looking for the streamlined non-competing award process versus non-SNAP awards and the authorities tied with those.
Yeah, so some key takeaways, I guess we'll both be involved here, is communication. So most foreign institutions need assistance in understanding the requirements for the NIH. So there may be, as we stated, unique policies or maybe unique regulations and practices. And so be patient. And
definitely be patient and start early. Start the communications early.
Definitely.
And with that, that's the end of our slide set. I'm gonna, we have a few additional slides that are included in the slide pack that you will have. We're not gonna cover those specifically. I know we're just at the amount of time that we were allotted to talk to you. So I am gonna stop sharing my screen so that we can answer your questions.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Dr. McGugan. We have about 10 minutes, so I'm gonna grab some questions in the Q&A. Reminder to those who have been entering, questions in the general chat feature. The questions are being referred to the Q&A functionality. Let me see if I can find some questions here for you. If we have a subcontract that's a foreign institution, will they require an EIN?
So the foreign institution isn't required to have a EIN. They were always required to have a DUNS number prior to the time of establishing that contract. And that actually brings up a great question, and I would have to investigate this, is whether or not the UEI would be required before the time of the subcontract was established. So that is a question that we will, if you come to the NIAID chat, we will have an answer for that by tomorrow. But the EIN is not required. Other questions for us, Cosima?
Will a complete set of the presentation slides be uploaded to the agenda? The current file is only the first slide. Let's see. The full presentation should be available to everyone. We will confer with the technical folks and make sure that that gets posted for you. As a reminder, the video will be posted within about 24 hours.
Other questions?
If I am awarded a grant, such as an R01, can I take it overseas if I decide to move?
So that's a good question. And the answer is what you will hear from I think in every session is it depends. So I think I went through that really quickly during the slide set. So let me do that a little bit more slowly. So anytime you would like to transfer an award from one organization to another, a couple of things need to happen. First, the grant is made to your institution. So the institution must relinquish the award, and then you would have to submit a new application from your new organization. And we're going to review that to make sure that the appropriate resources are in place at the new organization so that the science can be executed as it was originally planned. And then what we're going to do is, everything's okay with that, we're going to take that application to our National Advisory Board or Council and make sure that they agree to the funding of that at another organization, at that specific foreign organization. And if all of those things fall into place, we'll make that award to the foreign organization. That process can take some number of months, and I highly encourage you to reach out to both your program official and your grants management specialist before you even start that process, to know all of the steps that need to be taken.
Yeah, I would add that from the scientific standpoint, grants management, when they receive that, they also ask us to comment on the scientific aspects of the change. So as Emily mentioned, whatever you set out to do in the application, do you have the personnel at the new site? Do you have the resources, the lab space, things like that from a scientific standpoint?
Great, thank you. Next question, is the expiration date of an FOA or funding opportunity announcement equivalent to the deadline for the application?
So do you want to take that one? You want me to?
I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and one that I've seen before, and it really depends on how the FOA is, it depends, right, Emily? So usually when we set the end date, it's not right at a receipt date. So it may tell you that all applications need to be received by X, and that's the end of the funding announcement. Or it could be one where it's set for standard receipt dates. And when that happens, then if the FOA has not been reissued, then you need to make sure that you have submitted your application by the last submission date, the last standard submission date that falls within the FOA period, if that makes sense.
And often that expiration date will follow after the last submission date. So you really need to be looking for the submission dates, either in the standard table or in the FOA itself.
Exactly.
Great. Next question we have, the 8% F&A rate, is that only applicable to foreign entities, or does it apply to both foreign and domestic entities?
So the 8% rate applies to foreign applicants. So if you are a foreign applicant, you would apply the 8% F&A, but it also applies to foreign collaborators. So if you are a US organization collaborating with somebody overseas, for example, they can only request 8% on their portion of the work that they're proposing under the collaboration.
Can I do a quick add-on to that one that I've gotten? So maybe Emily can speak to that. If it's a foreign, direct to foreign award, but they have a US collaborator. So I often get, what is the F&A rate on the US collaborator?
So the US collaborator should still get their standard negotiated rate, right? So if there is a negotiated rate in place, which most of our most of our domestic applicants have, we will always be using their negotiated rate. So that's what you should include, and you should work with them to determine what that is.
And that doesn't count against your direct cost. So if in the FOA it says that the max cost is $250,000 or $120,000, that F&A to the US institution doesn't count against that. So I get that question a lot as well.
Correct. The F&A to any of the collaborating organizations would not count to your towards that cost cap.
Great, wonderful. Next question. If a foreign institution does not participate in an A133 audit, does that preclude them from submitting applications?
So I guess I need some clarification about does not participate. So there's a couple of different things. If you aren't required to have an audit, if you have no audit, that will not be an issue. But if you are required to have an audit, then it's like any other applicant or grantee, because you have to comply with the terms and conditions of award. And if you've reached that $750,000 threshold in HHS funding, you would need to comply with the audit requirement. It's not always an A133. There are other audit options as well, but you would have to comply with the audit requirement.
Wonderful. I've seen a couple of questions in the Q&A. Can you just remind everybody how they can best determine whether or not they have a scenario that meets the definition of a foreign component?
Sure. Glenn, you want to do that one?
Yeah, so that on the slide, it depends, as Emily said, but basically from a scientific standpoint, if the collaboration is just consultative in nature, so you're going to have a few phone calls with them, they're going to give you advice, that's not considered a foreign component. But if you have a collaborator that is doing a significant scientific portion of the project, maybe they're doing a specific aim, or maybe they're doing an animal model for you that you don't have, those are definitely considered foreign components and should be treated as such. So if you have questions, you can always contact program officer or a GM specialist, and they can walk you through that as well. I don't know if Emily wants to comment.
So I think that's a great explanation. And I would just add that regardless if there are human or animal subjects that are involved in that collaboration, even if no funding is going to that foreign site, we would still consider that a foreign component.
That's a good point.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to our presenters and our Q&A participants for this wonderful and informative session. If you have any additional questions, please visit our exhibit hall booth for chats and one-on-one opportunities. And you can also find the contact information in the help section on our grants.nih.gov webpage, as well as the helpful email addresses to reach out with inquiries that were in our presentation slides. Your feedback is very important. So we also ask that you please take a moment to let us know what your thoughts were on the session by clicking on the session feedback button located with the description and the presenters on the auditorium list of sessions. When you are completely done with the seminar, please also complete the overall survey form in the navigation bar at the top of the page. Thank you so much. Oh, yes.
I would just like to add one thing because this is a little bit unique, I think. Glenn and I know when we geared this session very much for beginners, right? But I know that we have some people that may have some more advanced questions. And so Glenn and I will be holding office hours. There will be information to come out about that, and we'll hold those tomorrow around 11:45. If you have additional questions or you want a smaller environment to ask your question, we welcome you to come there.
Wonderful. And Emily, is that located within the seminar platform, or will that be a separate?
I think it's going to be in the NIAD booth, and they're going to send out a little tickler later to let people know how to get there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Emily and Dr. McGugan. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.